And it's just that expectation that you'll pick it up and run with it without anyone taking a moment aside to explain to you why you're doing what you're doing, where it fits into the grand scheme of things. Because so many people are terrified of their CEO, thinking if they say anything remotely negative, they're going to get fired or restructured out. Whereas actually, the honest feedback is what people need to know. So it's how they get better.
Hi, Doug. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me.
It's great to see you.
Yeah, likewise.
So, I'm very interested and curious in your background. You are an HR consultant, but you got on this path because early on in your career, you had a bad experience yourself. Tell us
That's
about that.
right. Yeah. So what happened early on in my career is when I was a junior member of staff working at an assistant level, what I found was that I wasn't really shown what to do. I wasn't given a logical order, and there was just so many things that meant I wasn't well managed that could have been very easily avoided. And actually, it was one of the things that inspired me to get into HR in the first place. And then from there, it grew because I thought rather than being that reactive HR person that just fights fires after they've happened, let's see if we can prevent something, because enough knowledge and enough experience now at coaching managers and leaders through different situations to know what works and what doesn't. So yeah, that early experience, I'll just talk a little bit more about that. I started off in insurance before I joined HR, and I spent 2 weeks undergoing a very comprehensive training session in terms of how to use the computer systems. So we're going back nearly 20 years now. So it was a very different world back then. But then I was told, forget all that, you're going to be dealing with something completely different. And it's just that expectation that you'll pick it up and run with it without anyone taking a moment aside to explain to you why you're doing what you're doing, where it fits into the grand scheme of things. And from there, I thought, again, it puts me at risk of making mistakes. I don't like making mistakes. I like to get things right first time. And it just made me think, yeah, there has got to be some way that people can be better trained if you put them in a leadership position to be able to get the best out of their staff. Because I think there's just so many people who just don't know how to do that. So that is really in a roundabout way how I came to be doing what I'm doing.
Wow. Wow. So when you think about those days when we're getting trained and it was inefficient and you had a bad experience, what do you think that person was lacking? How could it have been done better for you to have had a better experience back then?
I think it would have been for them to have had some basic training and coaching around how to lead people and what people actually want out of coming to work in terms of a good experience. So it's shifting the mentality away from you should just be grateful to have a job and work here and we expect you to just pick it up by just being in the office, to let's see what we can do to make this quick and painless for everybody so we can get people up to speed, we can get them working at the right level, we can avoid complaints, we can avoid people getting annoyed and leaving. And people just don't always have the skills to do that because they're technically good, so they've been promoted, or they've been there a long period of time, so they've been promoted. But very rarely do people get the proper investment in those leadership skills. So I think to answer your question, to avoid that happening, it would have been some good leadership coaching and just getting that manager to put themselves in my shoes as a junior employee and think about how would I like to be treated and to design an experience around that.
Yeah. No, you got an excellent point, right? Those who get promoted sometimes get promoted because they're really good at their job. It's not because they're a good leader.
No, yeah, no one teaches them how to do that next step, and it's not something
Yeah.
that comes naturally to everybody. And
Yeah.
some people, from my experience, shouldn't be allowed anywhere near leadership ever because they just don't have the skill or the interest. And that's
Yeah.
fine. You can give them a technical manager role, you can advance their career in other ways. You don't have to be put in charge of people to advance your career.
What is intriguing to me is when you tell your story, every single time you pluck the strings on the guitar fretboard, two different strings. Once you talk about consistently about the lack of leadership and training this person had, but the other thing you keep talking about is also the treatment. So tell me a little bit about how the treatment is different than how a manager would just go about training somebody. What do you mean by that?
So I think it's the treatment of individuals and how people like to be treated and what they actually need when they're at work. There's a lot to be said for the term psychological safety. So where people feel they can be their authentic selves at work and they feel they can put their hand up, they can raise questions. Because I think so many capability cases, in my experience, have started with employees who are too scared to talk to their manager and admit they don't know what they're doing because they feel what the repercussions will be. So again, it's a manager making sure that they've got those qualities so that they are approachable and they get to know their team members, but they also know that those are individuals. So you might need to manage them all in slightly different ways ways to get the best out of them. So there's a lot to be said in terms of understanding a bit of basic human psychology and how people tick and what they actually want to get out of coming to work for a particular organization.
Why do you think that happens? Because what you just brought up is 100% correct, right? The ability to raise your hand and ask questions and wanting to be treated a certain way, wanting to be able to get the help that you need. These are all conditioned into us just going through the school system. We are encouraged to ask questions. So why does this change the moment you enter work? Because it seems it's so counterintuitive.
It does, and it just surprises me that still goes on because it's really common sense. I don't think I'm saying anything particularly clever. For me, it's just the best way of getting things out of people. But I think the way it changes is sometimes if people are promoted to leadership positions, they forget what it's like to be a junior member of staff themselves at entry level. So they don't always have that sort of empathy that they should have. And also they could be learning that behaviour from bad bosses they've had themselves. And they think that's the correct way to do it because another boss above them has done it that way in the past. So I think this is where that goes. And I think the third sort of factor you've got to add into this is just if you're in an organization where time is short, resources are short, and managers are under pressure to achieve targets and do other things, then sometimes the learning and development element and the nurturing element goes out the window. So I think it's a combination of those things that lead to this kind of that we see time and time again in the workplace.
Yeah. I understand, and I agree 100%. Do you think there is also a component of people not knowing how to handle power? That all of a sudden an regular employee has been promoted and is now a manager of 10, 15 people. Is it that they just don't know how to handle the newly gotten power of managing and leading people that kind of gets in the head?
Yeah, I think there is an element of that as well. It very much depends on the individual. But from my experience, there have been people who've been promoted who are very humble, but almost too humble. And humility is a good quality to have as a leader, but they're not forthright enough to be able to deal with issues when they shy away from having those tricky conversations. And then you've got the other extreme of the ego boost, where people want the fancy job title, they want the manager's salary, but they don't actually want to do the work that comes with it. And they think that by default, because they've got that title, they will get respect from their team, and that's not the way it works anymore. People want to see what the individual is like as a human being and whether they can relate to them. So there is a lot more that needs to be done. And again, people are not always taught about how to handle that stepping up from going to being just somebody's colleague to being their manager.
I love it. So let me ask you this question. You brought up a really interesting point about humility. And you said sometimes having somebody getting promoted who's too humble may not be a good thing. What do you mean by that?
So it's the person who almost up for their existence. It's somebody who might have a bit of imposter syndrome going on, which you do see with leaders and managers. And it can come out in one of two ways. They'll either be uber aggressive or egotistical, as we've just talked about, or they'll be very passive and timid, and they're too nervous to have a conversation or to step up or to confront people if things have gone wrong. Or they think that they feel that they're to blame for everything that's gone wrong. And actually that might not be the case. And as a manager, you're always going to be in a hierarchy somewhere, unless you're a CEO or chair of a board. So you're always going to be answerable to somebody. And quite often as a manager, you will find yourself stuck in the middle position. So you have to manage upwards to your own manager as well as downwards to your team.
I love how you put it. Somebody who apologizes about their existence. And I know this concept. I know of people who are like this, but I've never had it put this way. So it's very interesting. And it fits right in. There are people who are so apologetic, they'll apologize for anything and everything. It's somebody else's fault, right?
I know. And we see it over here in Britain. It's a very British trait as well.
Very British
to say sorry every other word, even when they shouldn't. And I've quite enjoyed some of the sarcastic responses I've heard people say back in the past, and I've refrained from using them myself. But I can see it, and I try to now only say sorry myself if I think I've actually done something wrong, not just because it's a natural part of conversation.
Yeah, no, I agree. So let's move on. You had a bad experience with somebody who just wasn't trained as a manager, as a leader. It sets you on a path so that now you are an HR consultant, an expert that helps develop great managers. But let's go back to, again, in those days. Obviously, you had a bad experience because you weren't trained well enough. But were there other things that developed within you? Stress, anxiety, imposter syndrome, anything else that happened because of that poor training?
At the time, yes. It's something I worked through myself to overcome. And actually, I experienced this very similar thing in my next job, which was actually my first ever HR job as an HR assistant. Again, I had a manager who was actually a nice person, but they'd learned some bad behavior from other managers around them. And I could see the way that they were treating people, myself included, wasn't good and didn't get the best out of me. And yes, towards the end of that 2 year stint I did there, I did feel very low self-esteem because I thought I just wasn't good enough and that it must be something I'm doing wrong. And again, I'd like to be critical of myself in a good way. I don't want to think I'm perfect. I still want to be open to learning opportunities and getting better. But actually, it took me a few years after that to actually believe in myself again and make me realize actually I do know what I'm doing. I am good at what I'm doing and I'm okay. Not everybody's going to agree with me all the time and I can live with that. But I've also a lot more confident now because I've got the knowledge of the last 20 years to stand up for myself when I need to.
Kudos to you. Having gone through such a traumatic experience, working on yourself to be not only the best version of yourself right now, but also empowering others to be the best version of themselves. Bullies exist everywhere. Bullies exist at work. Bullies exist in relationships. And a lot of times when we are bullied, we start developing imposter syndrome, where we start believing that we're simply not good enough. Right? Happens in marriages, happens in friendships, happens everywhere. So what you're teaching or what you're talking about is not just applicable to the corporate world, but also life in general. So tell us from the perspective of somebody who went through a phase in life where he felt he just simply wasn't good enough. How did you make that transition? What are a couple of things you can tell somebody who's listening to this that they can apply today to start making that transition?
So there's a couple of things I would advise here. I think the first thing it's really important for people to do is actually remember what they have achieved. And it's all too easy sometimes to just go through life forgetting what you've achieved. So I think it's good to just keep a little journal or a little note, write it down, write down the things you do well, as well as perhaps write down the things you want to get better at, or the things where you've learned a valuable lesson that you don't want to forget. And in that way, I think that works really well. So, yeah, people need to remind themselves what they're good at and why they are qualified and experienced to do what they're doing. I think the second thing is about showing people and having somebody to talk to so you're able to talk about how you feel. And in that way, you're not going to be alone in terms of how you deal with that self-doubt. I don't like cheap praise for the sake of it because you don't want somebody who's sympathetic. You want somebody who's empathetic. And a good mentor will tell you when you're wrong, but they'll encourage you when you're right. And you know you can trust their opinion rather than just somebody who tells you what they want to hear. I think the next 2 points I'd make on this one, they're easier said than done. But I think the next one is about stop comparing yourself to other people. There'll always be people better off than you. There'll always be people worse off than you. And I think that's fine. Same in business. Since I started my business, there's people doing better than me. There's people doing a lot worse. And we're just all on our own journey. And yeah, you will just become a bit vain and a bit bitter if you're always comparing yourself to perhaps people on social media. So again, really key to stop doing that. And the final thing I would say is when you do something well, show off your success. Do it in the right way. We talk about a humble brag sometimes. In fact, you try and get a bit of humility in there as well. And again, from a British point of view, we're not very good at boasting. We're always taught to be a little bit self-depreciating. But again, when you do something well, you've got to show it. You've got to shout about it. Otherwise, people won't realise you've done something well. And I think it's important that they see that. So yeah, those would be my tips in terms of helping somebody go from that journey of self-doubt and imposter syndrome to hopefully becoming more confident in themselves.
Yeah, this is such a good conversation. There's so many golden nuggets you're putting it out there. I'm so glad you're talking about this because we just talked about it in a joking way how British people are not good at taking credit for what they've done, right? But this extends outside of Britain. This is a worldwide problem. Maybe British people a little bit too much on this, but it exists everywhere else. Why do you think that is? Why do people shy away from taking credit for what they've done or be able to speak open and freely about their achievements? What is the psychological reason?
I think it's what will other people think of me?
Other people think of me.
And what I mean is, oh, they must think I'm really a big show off if I behave like that or put myself out there in that way. Or it opens the door for people to potentially put me down. And then I don't know how I deal with those negative comments I might get. So I think that's where it comes from. And again, it's very much a what will the neighbours say kind of mentality. And actually, in reality, the neighbours don't really care, and nor should you.
You're right. It is the uncertainty of the future. It is that how will I be perceived? How will I be considered? What opportunities may be taken away from me because I'm being perceived as a braggart or whatnot. But like you put it so perfectly, nobody cares. Yeah. Everybody is on their own path, doing their own thing with their own struggles. We are just too much in our own head. It's funny because when we don't talk about our accomplishments and we shy away. We do it because we don't want to be the center of attention. But ironically, thinking that everybody cares about us enough to worry about us at that level is thinking like the world revolves around us, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And I think actually one of my stepsons put it very nicely to me. It's you are the star of your own movie in your own life, and everybody else is a bit part. And I think that is often the way that the world goes, actually, when you look at it like that.
Very true. Very true. You laid out a couple of steps, right? Really good steps that listeners can utilize starting day one, working on that imposter syndrome. But there are logical steps. Sometimes logically, we know exactly what we need to do, but emotionally, we can't carry it out. What is the emotional component, you think, that is stopping people from just doing what they need to do, talking to somebody they love and expressing their feelings and writing down their accomplishments? What is the
It's
emotional block there?
it's fear and procrastination. I think it's fear of if this doesn't work, I don't know what to do next. I think that's the biggest one for people to overcome. Or, yeah, fear of how I'll be perceived if I talk to somebody. Yeah, as we were saying, it's fear of the unknown. And a lot of these things, yes, they might happen, but they also might not. And I think really the best thing to do then is have this, I suppose it does, worst case scenario, and how can I be prepared for that? And chances are it won't be as bad as people think to start to overcome it.
This fear and procrastination, do you think these are conscious blocks or do you think these are subconscious blocks?
I think they're subconscious, and I'm not a trained psychologist, but I think there's always reasons as to why things happen, and they can often go back to somebody's childhood or early experiences, and they don't even realize that's why they behave in a certain way or they react to certain things. And quite often, again, a technique I've seen used is if you're coaching somebody, if you keep asking why enough times over, usually about five, you'll finally get to the bottom of why something is a certain way. So really, a good coach will take somebody who's not feeling confident and they will keep asking why. That will take them back different steps. So if they're wondering why they're behaving a certain way in this year, it might go back to something that happened 20, 30 years ago, which they might not have realised. And sometimes for people, it's having that light bulb moment all the time in a busy life to actually do a bit of self-analysis.
Talking of coaching, let's talk about how you coach leaders now. We talked about your past experience. We talked about the lessons you learned through suffering yourself, because there's wisdom in suffering. The wisdom we get from suffering ourselves is far more richer and deeper than we get from just reading a book. How has that informed upon what you do now? How do you go about coaching leaders?
So what I do is I run programs which I've deliberately made very practical in terms of tips, because there's a lot of stuff out there. You can read the theories, you can write the academic essays and get the qualification. But what I've tried to do is actually take my learners on a journey. So we start with talking about how to recruit the right people, and we finish it with how to say goodbye to them at the end of their career with that organization. And it's all the steps that happen in between. And I think that's what often lacks, is those practical tips you can apply straight away. And we do a mixture of what the law says versus how to be psychologically good at getting the best out of your team, how to do that motivation piece that we've talked about. And I also do a lot of one-to-one coaching during the sessions as well. So again, if people are nervous and they've got a particular situation they want to discuss, they've got the chance to do it one-to-one where there's no judgment from anybody else and they can just open up, because not everybody has got that sounding board in their life, particularly if they're a manager and it's their own business and all their employees reporting to them and they don't have anybody else to bounce ideas off. So I think what I try and do is create that safe environment where people can learn and grow from each other as well as from me, and they can come away feeling a lot more confident than they were at the start.
So let's talk about some practical scenarios. I have some employees. I used to be a professional consultant before I managed dozens and dozens of employees. I work with CEOs who have hundreds of employees. A lot of the leaders will complain that the employees on their team are not giving their best, right? They are doing their bare minimum. They're not doing so little that they will need to get fired or reprimanded, but they're also not coming to work every single day wanting to do the best. Conventional wisdom, conventional is get to know the employee, get involved in their lives, making them feel part of the team. And these CEOs that I speak to will swear up and down that they do all of that. As an expert in this field, what are some other steps that you lay out that the listeners might be able to benefit from in terms of how to get the best out of your employees? Because you're literally watching an A player sabotage themselves and the team by performing at a B or a C level. What do you do?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is, as an organization, if you're a CEO, do you know what your mission, vision, and values are, and have you communicated them to your team? Because otherwise, you might be really passionate about your business and experienced. I mean, no one's ever going to be as passionate about your business as you are if you're a founder and it's your baby. But you've got to infuse your team in the same way. They might not know why they really exist. They might know what service or products is provided, but they don't perhaps understand how their role fits into the bigger picture if it's a large company, or they might not see how what they do is actually making any real difference. So I think you've got to really communicate, going back to why do you exist at all as an organization? And that is one way of getting them enthused. And I think the second way is empowering people to solve problems, because that's fundamentally why people come to work, is to solve a problem one way, shape, or form. And people want to feel that these days that the job they're doing is in line with their own personal values and that they're making a difference in the world. So again, you've got to lean into that one. And also you've got to be a manager that's not so hands-on that you micromanage. So you actually empower people to think of solutions for themselves rather than just being told what they've got to do. Because people deep down like to think, they like to feel they've made a difference. And again, it will give them courage and confidence to know that they've got the ability to do that rather than just do a robotic style reply or do the bare minimum. Related to that, another good option for people is to do very short, sharp bursts of gathering employee data about how people are feeling at the moment and why. You can use electronic means to do this. You can do it anonymously. I don't believe in annual staff surveys because they take ages to do, they take ages to analyse, and by the time you've said what you're doing as a result of it, everybody's left because it's been months. So short, sharp bursts, it will give you insights and data into why people are feeling the way they are at the company and why they're perhaps just doing the bare minimum. And then you can actually take some decisive, quick action as the CEO. And I think the danger point I've seen in the past of these is where CEOs hear something that they don't want to hear because it makes them feel uncomfortable because it's made them realize that their business isn't as perfect as they thought it was, and there's issues that they need to solve, and then it's detracting them from their main job of trying to make money and keep an organization going. Yeah, that would be my advice in terms of the things beyond the traditional advice. It still pays to get to know the team, have the human connections, have the regular check-ins, all of that sort of thing, but those are the extra things I would be doing as well, which are more fundamental and are more likely, I think, to solve the problem.
Love the idea of the short burst of getting feedback as opposed to once a year evaluations and once a year feedback, because you're right, they take forever and feelings change by the end of the year. If a survey is done during Christmas time, people are going to report very differently than if the survey is done during summertime versus the winter time. So I'm a CEO. I just did a short survey, and I'm reading and I'm analyzing the data. It looks like people are not very enthused, right? Some people are happy, some people are average, some people are not happy with certain policies, procedures. It's all over the place, right? What are the first couple of things that I can do as a CEO to try to turn this around?
I think it will be take a deep dive into the areas that aren't working, where you've got the negative feedback. Now, some people use somebody independent like me to do a bit of digging and to report back with some recommendations. Other CEOs might want to do it themselves, depending on the size of the business. But it goes back to keep asking why and make sure that you've built that culture where people feel that if you ask them a question, they will answer it honestly rather than tell you what you want to hear. Because so many people are terrified of their CEO, thinking if they say anything remotely negative, they're going to get fired or restructured out. Whereas actually, the honest feedback is what people need to know. So it's how they get better. And I think if you tap into how people are feeling and where it's come from, you can then solve the problem. It could often be down to poor communication or poor leadership. And that's usually the reasons I see globally for why things are failing in a business. And then you work out your strategies for how you get better at both of those things.
That was going to be my next question, which is that having done this for such a long time, where do you think the biggest gaps are? And you said communication and leadership. That can mean a lot of things. Can we be a little bit more specific and say exactly what you're noticing is a trend?
Yeah. So with communication, it's just messages are not conveyed in the right way at the right time to the right people. And I know some departments have internal comms, or some people will send out emails to try and the whole company at the same time. Founders need to find a way that works well for them and that will get their messages across to the business in the best possible way. But quite often people moan about communication. So if something happens in a business, something changes and people don't know about it, or they find out about it through the back door, it really deep people because they think I can't be that important if nobody's told me, but it actually impacts my role. So therefore, people don't understand what I do and they don't see the importance of what I do. So I think there's a lot of that. And it doesn't mean to say that CEOs have to tell everybody everything, because obviously there's commercially sensitive things out there that shouldn't be shared. But I think a good CEO has to do regular updates with their staff, and they will share with them what they can, and they'll explain why they can't share other things. And I think, again, it builds that trust. And I think it's regular communication. And in terms of the poor leadership side, again, it's things we've discussed already. It's people's line managers perhaps making some of those fundamental mistakes by not checking in regularly with the team, or micromanaging them, or being so hands off that nobody knows what they're doing and there's no real direction or enthusiasm for the work because people are pulling in different directions. So again, it's fixing a lot of those things. And there's so many people, so many organizations that think that it's an easy fix just to give somebody who has a bit of a moan a pay rise, a promotion, free pizza on a Friday. Doesn't work. You've got to fix these fundamental things first. Otherwise, the other stuff will mean absolutely nothing.
It's so funny you say it that way because I have been part of organizations, really high stressful ones as well, where life was just not good at all. Everybody was scared to come to work. Everybody hated to come to work. People literally just came to work because they just needed a paycheck. And management's idea of motivating people was just to get them pizza on a Friday or allow them to come in like a sports jersey instead of wearing a proper uniform.
And I can see why they think that way, but yeah, it really doesn't work. And if you know your team well, you will know what motivates them, and money isn't the main motivator. Yes, people have bills to pay, they want a regular income, that's why they come to work, they don't do it for free. Other things motivate people more, and sometimes it's as a way of a simple thank you, or feeling safe, or feeling they've got a good relationship with their manager who trusts them and backs them up when they need it and gives the advice that they need if they need help. And that will mean so much more than any amount of free pizza or being allowed to dress down on Friday.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to the communication bit, I do have a question. You talked about how sometimes the best way for a CEO to communicate is not through an email blast. What are some alternative ways? Are you talking about town hall meetings, or what are we talking
It very much depends on the organisation size, but sometimes a town hall meeting works well. Sometimes it could be a podcast, a webinar, or just a brief sort of article on the intranet. Again, it's very varied, but it's got to be the right tone and style, because you don't want to sound too authoritarian about the whole thing.
Yeah.
So you've got to make sure that the way you're saying your message is resonating with your employees, and it very much depends on the environment again. So if you're working in a manufacturing environment, you might just need to literally stand on the end of the shop floor and shout at people through a megaphone so people hear you. If it's a more corporate environment, just walking around and speaking to department by department might work, or again, getting everyone together on an all hands call. So there's different ways of doing it. And it's really what messages are you trying to get across? How is the business performing? And it's people don't always want to know the statistics, because yes, you can show them graphs to show the profitability, but people want to actually know the stories behind it. Because I've discovered over the years, I'm a very factual person and I like logic. So I've had to adapt my style and tell more stories to get my points across.
I love it. Let me ask you this question in a completely different vein of things. Everybody's scared of HR, right? HR, for most people, stands for the department that fires you, the department that reprimands you, the department that brings compliance in to monitor you. As an HR consultant, you're walking into an organization with a desire and a willingness to help make them better. Real world experience based on what you've done and the interactions you've had. How receptive are CEOs to some of these changes that you're talking about?
So much goes back to them trusting me, knowing me, liking me, and me building a relationship with them. Because as you say, most of my battles is trying to change the perceptions of what HR is and does. There's plenty of social media posts out there saying HR is not your friend, which doesn't help with the concept. But ironically, when it comes to marketing myself, I have to lean into some of those perceptions somehow for businesses about, yes, there is a bit of recruitment involved in HR. There is a bit of getting rid of people at the end of it if it's not working out. But they forget all the other things that happen in the middle. And actually, as a professional, what I've learned is to be a people expert, to know how people tick, and to advise and coach managers in terms of getting the best out of their teams, whether that's formally or informally. So, yeah, there's a bit of compliance in there as well, because no business owner wants to get sued. So I am on a mission to try and prevent that. But that can be done in so many ways. And it's not just about boring things like policies and procedures. Yes, they need to exist. We need to do them. But I try to do so much more about creating the good employee experience and training and coaching the managers in how to do things correctly. And then hopefully that way it will prevent a lot of those other issues occurring. So you do get good performing employees, you do get people who don't want to run away to the competition, and actually if we're used as a function and we're informed and consulted about what the business plan is, the business strategy, the business vision, we can actually contribute to that and put it into practical terms and say, okay, here's how we can help get you as a business to where you want to be, and use your people as a way of doing that, rather than being seen as traditional admin function that processes stuff. And yeah, while there's a bit of it, it's really not the best way of using HR, and there's so much more we can do if our business owners out there trust us to confide in us and tell us what they want to do, and we will help them get there, and we will do it safely as well so they don't accidentally get sued along the way.
Absolutely. Do you find sometimes that CEOs and leaders are somehow self-sabotaging themselves? Are there places where they themselves are the impediment that they need to overcome?
Yeah, they do it all the time. And it's because, again, they're just based on their own experiences of what's happened in the past. There's also this, and I'm thinking of one MD I've worked with in the past here, the struggle of loss of control. And the one thing I've learned as a business owner is you can't be good at everything and nobody's expecting you to be. So if you are the CEO of a business, you don't have to be an expert in HR, finance, marketing, sales, IT, facilities. You pay experts to advise you on that stuff, and you focus on the bits you love, which should be having an idea for a product or a service that makes the world a better place and doing what you can to promote and develop it. And then you pay the expert to do the other bits. And I think this is where I've seen the self-sabotage, is where these people can't let go and they want to control absolutely everything. And while they should know what's going on under their own nose, they don't need to have a finger in every pie all the time.
Why do you think that is? Because it's basically an inflated situation of micromanagement, right? An exaggerated micromanagement situation.
And it's about a bit of ego, perhaps, or about a bit of the fact that nobody's ever taught them that it's okay to do it differently to how they're doing it. And no one's going to think any less of them if they're not all everything in their business all the time. People ultimately need to look up to them and respect them. And if they carry on doing that, it's not going to work. So again, it takes the right sort of person to be able to be self-critical in a positive way and think, okay, how can I change my behavior? And it must make me less stressed in the process if I'm trusting people to get on with things rather than trying to control everything. Because again, I've seen it where they're bottlenecks and they want to approve everything. And actually, you should be able to delegate approval out to a certain level.
100%. How does this affect the individual? I know we talked about a lot about affecting the company, affecting the employees, but being so wired where you feel like you need to have your fingers into everything all the time. How does this affect the individual, and how do you help them get better?
So it dramatically increases their risk of burnout and stress and anxiety. And the way I help them is I try and get them to see I paint a picture of what good could look like if they did things differently. They've got to be receptive to hear that message, but then I can show them, okay, this is how you delegate and this is how you do things differently in a business. And this is stuff I've done in the past where I had an MD he had a team of directors all on six-figure salaries who all still literally queuing up at his door asking for approval for stuff because he hadn't let go of it. And again, I'm saying your leadership team will feel a lot more empowered and happier if you just let them get on with it, and they'll come to you if they need a big decision on something. Or so again, it's putting those basic communication things in place and also getting them to send the message out to that team that it's all right for them to do things and they are trusted and empowered. So yeah, I'm trying to do whatever I can to alleviate the stress of MDs, founders, CEOs, whatever they call themselves, where I possibly can.
Yeah, the stress, the anxiety, burnout, not being able to take a vacation because they're still working on their vacation because they feel like they have to be doing this all the time, or else the company will just sink if they're just not there. These have a compounding effects on mental health, which then trickles down into physical health. So in a way, not only are you helping companies more profitable, teams get more efficient and productive, but CEOs to not only be better leaders, but also better people inside and outside of work.
Exactly. And that's where I feel I can add really good value to a business. I'm not just about coming in to do an investigation or doing a disciplinary hearing on somebody or doing a settlement agreement. There's just so much more, like I've said earlier, if we are used properly as a profession.
Yeah. So tell us, our audience, a little bit about what are the different forms that you work in, how they can connect with you, how they can get your help.
Okay, so this QR code for those who are watching it rather than listening will allow people to connect with me across all my social media channels. It takes you to my LinkedIn page. But also, if they just want some free tips and advice, I do weekly email bulletins on it, so they can just go to my website, www.surebetshr.com, and you can sign up for a free newsletter. In terms of how I work with people, I provide the two services. I provide my 10-week coaching program for new line managers. So this is just practical tips once a week for an hour for 10 weeks, and people can sign up and find out more, join the waiting list through the website. Alternatively, for businesses who need my help, whether it's to solve a specific problem, or I just do an audit for a lot of new businesses, so I can tell them how compliant they are and whether they need to do anything differently. And yeah, that's often a good way in for me to start helping them to become the great businesses I know they want to be while they're compliant, and they can sleep safe at night knowing that they're not going to get a fine or a prison sentence for doing something they shouldn't have done.
Wow. I love it, Doug. I get an opportunity to meet so many talented, passionate people around the world, but very rarely do I meet somebody who also has such a genuinely warm personality. You are not only extremely knowledgeable, your work is built on the foundation of personal pain and suffering that you went through, but instead of becoming a victim to it, you took all of that and you have made a career out of it, and not only helping organizations like we talked about, but also helping the employees and CEOs become better version of themselves. So it's nothing but an honor and privilege to meet you. It's astounding to see you at work, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
All right, thanks, Mark. It's been a good conversation. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.